There are groups that are now suggesting that individuals' involvement in politics is a matter that is subject to privacy concerns, including their donations made in our elections. On the other hand, information transparency in our elections is essential to being able to place an informed vote. Knowing who is financially backing a candidate is essential to deciding what a candidate will support once in office. Hi, I'm Hank Mayers, and the purpose of my presentation today is to help explain where and the why transparency is essential to the health and well-being of our elections as well as to our democracy. Frequently, people speak to the right of privacy as part of our First Amendment to our Constitution. However, the First Amendment does not explicitly provide such a right. The first right in the First Amendment is the right of religious freedom, and what is meant by that is that people have a right to follow any religion and that there shall be no laws about any religion. The second right in the First Amendment is the right of freedom of speech. And what is meant here is that you can speak your mind, and as subsequently clarified by the Supreme Court, you cannot, however, endanger others or inspire hate with your speech. The third part of the First Amendment is the freedom of the press. This right holds that formalized publishers can't be silenced, but they can be sued for defamation and slander. The fourth element of the First Amendment is an individual's right to peaceably assemble. What this means, of course, is that you can join any group you wish, and you can meet in public or private, and do so peacefully. You can protest as well, as long as you are doing that peacefully. The fifth right in the First Amendment is our right to petition the government to address any of our concerns as an individual or as in the context of a group. So what about this right of privacy that's talked a lot about? Well, in truth, it's not explicitly cited in the Constitution. We've kind of gone over that. However, the Supreme Court has, in a number of cases in more recent history, concluded that privacy is in fact implied in some elements of the Constitution, such as in the First Amendment. There's the right to not have the government involved in your religious practices. In the Third Amendment, your home cannot be entered or occupied by the Army except only when there is a war, and that entry would have to be authorized by some kind of law. The Fourth Amendment says that your person, your home, your papers, and your property cannot be seized without a warrant. In addition to these implications in the Constitution, there was a famous case in 1955 called Alabama versus the NAACP, in which the U.S. Supreme Court recognized the right of privacy in associating, particularly when one's association could include the likelihood of risk to your person or your property. In 1955, being a member of the NAACP in the South was indeed a risky association. The upshot of this decision was that SCOTUS gave all of the 501c4 social welfare groups the right to privacy. Further, these groups are not required to prove the existence of personal risk to their members. So the context for this material is really the fundamental question of, do you have a right of privacy in political activity? So there appears to be some confusion over how we balance the implied privacy rights in our associations and the need for transparency in our political processes. In fact, some stages appear to need the implied right to privacy, but the success of other stages utterly depends upon having information be transparent and widely available. Fundamentally, as we look at our actual elections, transparency is indeed essential. Transparency is essential if we are to achieve and maintain the following objectives for our elections. First, level the playing field for candidates in our elections. 2, achieving a truly informed voter, and by doing so, 3, reduce voter cynicism and disengagement. 4, minimizing the rancor in our elections, and by so doing, 5, reducing the present subsequent extreme partisanship that we see in our legislatures. So really, in a lot of ways, the vitality of our elections and our democracy depends upon an understanding of this key civic subject by all the voters. When does privacy make sense, and when does transparency make sense? So let's spend a minute looking at the needs for transparency in our elections. Well, it all comes down to this. For your vote to matter, you need to be able to get the information that you need to decide for yourself who will be the best candidate to vote for. And that candidate is the one who best represents your views. Put more simply, the key thing that you as a voter need to know is what will that candidate do when she or he gets into office? Whose needs will she or he represent or support? So one of the answers to this is who gave the candidate campaign money? Why? Because it takes a big pot of money to run a campaign and win. So a candidate needs a lot of money. A public official is always grateful to the people that help put him or her into office. Just as important, politicians need to keep big donors happy if that money is going to come again during the next election, which will be his or her re-election. It's clear that wealthy special interests are indeed not stupid, for they give money to candidates that agree with them, and their donations are seen as investments in future favors or, if you will, displays of gratitude by the elected official that they support. Now, you can also take a look at who supported a candidate with support ads. And equally informative is knowing who funded the attack ads on the candidate. The above information is very valuable in predicting with some level of confidence which of the candidates that you can vote for will actually represent you. So the bottom line is two things. One, your country needs you to vote. The second part is if your vote is going to do you any good, your country needs to allow you as much objective information as you can get on the candidates. Indeed, we like to consider this balanced arrangement as America's voting contract. To understand how the principle of privacy and the principle of transparency can both play a valid role, we need to take a look at the larger context in which elections take place. An election is an essential part of the life cycle of a political idea or a candidate seeking office. The political cycle pretty much begins with an individual having an idea or viewpoint that they've concluded needs to become a formal part of American society and its politics. So at that point, then we move to the next stage in the cycle of political ideas, and that's where the individual begins to pursue the political idea and seek champions and other parties to endorse and support the new idea. This stage of activity is frequently considered the advocacy stage. The next stage is the election cycle, and the predominant activity is, as you might guess, supporting the cause or individual that's part of the election by casting your ballot. One of the things that contributes to the confusion over where privacy begins in this process is that advocacy and support activities depend upon basically the same kinds of processes or strategies that are used in both these stages. Both involve speaking to others, lobbying others, influencing others, organizing groups into campaign entities, and the like. But while these activities may bear a strong resemblance to each other, the nature of the settings in which they take place are significantly different. The election stage is inherently a very public process of engaging others, weighing claims, and making informed choices in the political marketplace by giving proper weight to different speakers and messages. The next stage is where the voter actually makes their decision by casting their ballot, electronically or by paper in their home. The final stage is after the election, where the idea has either won or lost. If victory has been the outcome, then we proceed by taking legislative action to institutionalize the idea, or the winning candidate starts working in the legislature. If a loss was the outcome of the election, then the next stage is to renew or revise the effort, or the idea itself, and pursue the political idea once again and keep advocating. In effect, what you're doing is returning to stage 2. So now let's consider the application of privacy and transparency to these stages. Stage 1 is the idea stage, and it is in the true privacy of our own thoughts or discussions with our closest political friends where this activity takes place. This stage is protected and warrants privacy. Stage 2, building the idea and constituency, is when we begin to promote our idea in ever-growing circles of trust, seeking limited exposure for our ideas that we know may not be popular, like rights for Negro minorities in the South in 1955. So this stage of advocacy is one in which it can be appropriate that such activities can invoke the privilege of privacy for the participants. Stage 3 is focused on informing and convincing the public. Well, this is when the political marketplace is its noisiest during our elections. This is the most public of all the stages, and this is when the voter must be provided transparently with the essential information needed for an informed decision for the upcoming vote. Stage 4 is when the voter decides and casts his or her vote in the privacy of the voting booth or the home via absentee ballot. Stage 5 is the post-election stage. As we mentioned earlier, if the election was won, then it's on to working in the legislature. While there are activities in the legislature to achieve some stealth, the legislature fundamentally is intended to be an open, transparent, and deliberative body. Thanks to the internet, there have been some great inroads for transparency. But there are many more improvements needed for greater transparency, such as financial disclosure by public officials, applying FOIA, that's the Freedom of Information Act, to the legislature, and greater lobbying disclosure. If the issue or individual was defeated in the election, the cause will need to return to advocating at Stage 2 and can operate with privacy if it wishes. So in summary, Stage 1 is private. Stage 2 is semi-private, but can still invoke privacy and refuse to report on its donors and its expenditures. Stage 3 must be an open, transparent stage if our elections are to serve their foundational principle in fostering our democracy. Stage 4 is utterly private. Stage 5 is open and meant to be transparent if we are engaged in the activity of the legislature. You may downshift to privacy because the effort will be to return to advocating for your issue in the next cycle of election activity. There are an increasing number of nonprofit groups registered with the IRS that have the right to not disclose their political activities or their financial transactions, and that these groups are significantly engaged in the political process. This slide lists the classification of such groups. The 501c3s are your typical charities such as churches and public interest groups that focus on such things as clean water. Donations to these groups are deductible from your federal taxes. 501c4s are called social welfare nonprofits, and they cover a wide range of activity and are frequently engaged in the political process. It is not uncommon for public interest groups to have both a 501c3 for tax-deductible donations and a 501c4 for work in the political sphere. However, you will see in the next slide that certain types of these monies can be in one phase and one phase only. 501c5s are agricultural and labor nonprofits. Most unions are considered 501c5s. 501c6s are businesses and trade nonprofits. Chambers of commerce are typically classified as 501c6s. 501c7s are generic social clubs, some of which engage in political activity and do not have to report. Commercial corporations, as a result of Buckley versus Vallejo, that's a Supreme Court decision, as well as the more popularly known Citizens United, now are considered persons and can engage in politics and do not have to disclose their activity. And as persons, they can engage in any activity in the political process. Limited liability corporations have the same rights as persons like the commercial corporations. Lately, these kinds of entities are being used more frequently to mask the identity of the original donor. In effect, the check isn't written out of their personal checkbook, it's written out of their LLC. The purpose of Slide 10 is to explain the extent of involvement that these non-disclosing organizations have in the political process. The focus here is Stage 2, the advocating stage, and Stage 3, the election stage. So we've trimmed off the previous diagram so we can help focus us on those two. First up is the 501c3s, the charitable organizations. They are allowed to engage and spend no more than 20% of their resources in the advocacy process, which is Stage 2, and that's the only process that they can engage in. The next group of non-disclosures is the 501c4s, and they have no limits placed on the amount of activity that they can engage in Stage 2, the advocacy stage. And they can engage in Stage 3 with a limit of no more than 50% of their resources spent in election activities. All of the rest of the 501cs have the same limitations. As pointed out in the previous slides, LLCs and commercial corporations have no limits to the resources they can apply to any stage in the political process. Slide 11 has been prepared to show the inequities in the disclosure regulations as they apply to the election stage. and how that seriously limits a voter's ability to evaluate ballot measures and candidates for public office. The gold bars are representing the non-disclosing groups that we saw on the previous slide, and they're being repeated here. Here is the 501c3 charities. Here is the 501c4 and related groups with their involvement extending into the election stage. And even then, that's supposed to be only 50% of their resources. Here are the LLC commercial corporation persons with their involvement extending into the election stage. But now let's look at the other election participant groups who are required to financially report to the Secretary of State. And we'll color these groups green. First, we have the political parties. They can participate in stages 2, 3, and 4. They are the only ones who can do things to impact the election day itself, stage 4. These activities include such things as taking people to the polls. Next, we present the PACs and super PACs, who also must file financial reports on donors and expenditures. Note that they have to report even during the advocacy stage, where the nonprofits don't. Lastly, we have the candidates themselves, their election committees. They must report on all donors and expenditures. However, they are limited to stage 3 only, that being the election. So, bottom line on this graphic is really this. The 501c4s and their cousins, the 6s and the 7s, and the LLCs and the commercial corporations all have an inappropriate advantage. But that's only half of the story. Given that these sources of election funding have grown at geometric rates since the Citizens United Supreme Court decision, they now outspend the parties and their candidates. They are the biggest players, and yet there is no information on their donors and their expenditures. And they are the sources of what we are now calling dark money, because we don't know where it came from. We believe the equal protection element of the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, is being violated right here. Voters have been denied essential information on the biggest backers of today's candidates for public office. Further, voters' right to know who is backing their candidates, their right to be able to cast an informed and meaningful vote, has been and is still being denied. We have a few takeaways that we would like to leave with you. First, we have 3 overriding principles about our elections. The first principle is that the election is fundamentally a public process. The second principle is transparency of financial information is essential to having engaged and informed voters. And lastly, all participants in the election process must be treated equally and have the same obligations. Additionally, there are 2 things that we think need changes to achieve the principles I just talked about. The first change is that the election phase needs to be clearly defined. When does it start? We think we pretty much know when it ends because that's when the election's over. The second thing that needs changing is that everyone in the election process must disclose ownership, financial activity, and their public communications. Thank you for sharing your valuable time with us. This material on the need for transparency in our politics is being provided to you by our Show Me the Money campaign. If you wish to learn more about our efforts to require transparency in our elections and establish America's voting contract, please visit our website at www.showmithemoney.org. And thanks for your curiosity about making money in our elections transparent. Bye now.